All right, and welcome to the Stewardship Network's monthly webcast. Once again, my name is Rob Luzinski, and I'm the community coordinator at the Stewardship Network. Let's start with a little bit about us. TSN is a 501c3 nonprofit organization with an award-winning 20-plus year history. We are now serving 30-plus place-based TSN member communities and fiscally sponsored projects across the Great Lakes and across the country. And in addition, many TSN programs like this one are available to all, so we hope that you will join us for this webcast and many more. Our mission is to connect, equip, and mobilize nature's caretakers. So I'd like to take a little bit of time to dig into the various aspects of that mission now. First, connect. We bring stewards together to share knowledge, resources, and inspiration with one another. Equip. We remove hurdles so stewards can pour more energy into their ecosystems and communities. And mobilize. We amplify the impacts of your collaborative stewardship here at home and nationwide. Now we'd like to dig a little bit deeper into that mobilize aspect of our mission because we have one of our favorite programs that's currently running that we want to remind you about. And that is the Stewardship Network Spring Challenge. So as many of you know, this has started on April 8th of this year and it will go through June 30th. And the general idea is do more together. So let's learn a little bit more about the Spring Challenge. For an overview, it was built to increase the impact and awareness of collaborative stewardship activities through peer motivation since 2008. TSN member communities, stewardship professionals, and volunteers are all meaningfully involved in the program. And it's a celebration of what's already happening and a rallying cry to join in so we can do more together. Once again, you can visit stewardshipnetwork.org/spring if you'd like to learn more about the program in general, and also that's where you can submit. A little bit about the attention and motivation. Our job here is to shout out your rolling achievements all season long and honor exceptional efforts at the end. So everybody, we want to celebrate you in one way or another. And we want to remind you that TSN Spring Boosts are back with more donated goodies because early, consistent reporting is the key to building and maintaining momentum. So if that is good motivation for you, please do submit your hours, stewardshipnetwork.org/spring. We'd love to not wait until the very end if possible. Please do submit them and share your stories and your photos with us because we love to share those on our social media and in our email newsletters. And it's a great way to just share your story with the rest of our network. Now for a week 8 update on some numbers here. So we are at over 38,000 total hours, which is 140% of this point in 2025. That is very exciting. And we are at over 11,500 total participants. And once again, that is all of you, every individual that is doing this incredible work. We cannot thank you enough for being a part of the program. You could see that amazing big number over there on your right, and we hope to keep increasing it throughout the rest of the program cycle. So once again, visit stewardshipnetwork.org/spring, and we would love to get your submissions there. A little bit as we approach kind of the season finale, the final stretch of this wonderful program. This is it, folks. The program officially ends on June 30th, and all activities through that date qualify. So once again, April 8th through June 30th, any activities in that time frame will qualify. Participating makes you awesome, but not waiting until the last day makes you Rachel's favorite. And I would argue it makes you everyone's favorite. Now, Rachel, of course, is our wonderful program manager that helps to tally all of your numbers up. And that's what allows us to have our great celebration in our July webcast every year. And so the earlier you can submit, the better we can stay on top of those numbers and not do all of them at the end. That being said, we understand that some folks might be doing stewardship all the way up until June 30th. If that is the case, we generally do leave the form open just a little bit after that deadline, but don't wait too long because once again, we will have to close it to start tallying up those numbers and make sure that we have everything ready. We will only have about a week to get those numbers ready for the July webcast. So thank you very much for being as timely as you can in this busy season. And with that, yes, final results TBA at the July webcast. So please do join us for the July webcast. You'll hear more about what that webcast is at the end of this presentation. So now we have Sophie Llenos, a PhD candidate in Earth and Environmental Science with Michigan State University. And the presentation today is Beyond Extraction, Rethinking Mining Ethics Through Community and Care. Sophie, with that, I would love to have you share your screen.
Sounds good. Just a second here. All righty. Are we looking good?
That is looking good. Thank you very much.
All right, perfect. Well, first, thank you all for being here today, and thank you to the Stewardship Network for inviting me. It's really great to be here. My name is Sophie Llenos, and I'll be sharing some collaborative work focused on expanding ethics in mining contexts. Before we begin, I do want to acknowledge that folks come to conversations about mining with a wide range of perspectives, experiences, and emotions. And, we can recognize that mining is a complex and often contested space shaped by many factors. So what I'm sharing today is just one effort within that broader landscape and really just be thinking about what we can learn from this. So with that, I appreciate you all being here and engaging in this conversation and learning with me. So I'd like to start by introducing myself and kind of really briefly situating my positionality. I'm a German and Irish settler guest, fourth generation, born in what is now the United States on my father's side, and second generation on my mother's side, living on Anishinaabe or Anishinaabe land, north of Wauwatonuxw, what is now known as Detroit, Michigan. On a more personal note, I'm an outdoor recreator, a researcher, wife, daughter, and friend, among other things. And on the professional side, I hold a bachelor's degree in geology with a minor in anthropology, and I'm currently a PhD candidate in earth and environmental science at Michigan State University. So that's enough about me. I want to especially acknowledge the guidance and contributions of my core team, which you can see here, especially Jade Mitchell, Julie LeBarkin, Diane Dobrnek, Kathy Brosmer, Jolaine Love, and Carolina Londoño Michel. And I also really want to acknowledge our project partners who are not pictured here, but this work would not have been possible without the contributions of our partners across tribal, industry, regulatory, and STEM contexts in the Great Lakes region. And so in this presentation, I'll refer to partners in more general terms to respect confidentiality, as not all collaborators consented to being publicly identified. So I did just want to note that in the beginning, but my appreciation for them is still so very great. So starting with the basics, what is mining? It sounds like a simple, silly question, but mining can really be defined in a lot of different ways. In simple terms, and for the purposes of this presentation, when I talk about mining, I'm referring to the removal of geologic materials such as metals, minerals, and stone from the earth. And globally, mining involves a really wide range of materials and is carried out through a variety of methods. And it really depends on the nature of the material, the place, location, and the scale of extraction. So turning to what is now Michigan, where I'm working, mining has occurred here since time immemorial, and this is supported by oral tradition and archaeological evidence dating back to 8,000 years. So the pictures you see here are from the National Park Service, and the photos on the left and the right are images of pits where native copper was extracted by indigenous peoples in the Keweenaw Bay area, as well as Minong, what is now known as Isle Royal. And then in the middle there, you can also see a hammerstone that would have been used to extract and process mined material in those regions. So mining in Michigan looked like this for a very long time until in the mid-1800s, when Michigan's mining landscape shifted with the arrival of large-scale industrial extraction, which, as we know, continues today, and this occurs through both underground and surface mining methods. In present-day Michigan, we're mining for copper, nickel, iron ore, sand, gravel, and limestone, along with extraction of other materials. And so I really want to start by kind of grounding us and thinking about why is this conversation important for all of us, even if we're not necessarily working in mining contexts or on the front lines of the mining industry? Well, mined materials globally shape our everyday lives. And just some examples are transportation, phones, cellular and digital communication, computers, which I'm giving this presentation on, and you might be tuning in from today, energy, and that includes renewable energy infrastructure, building materials, even things like windows, life-saving medical technology, even things as simple as toothpaste. We also need mining for food processing and packaging, for table salt, cleaning supplies, deodorant and other hygiene products, TVs. The list can really go on. And so my point here is that mining touches us all in many ways. And in a lot of ways, our current lifestyles are dependent on mined material. Now, at the same time, the contemporary mining landscape is deeply contested, with mining activities linked to environmental degradation, climate change, human rights violations, community displacement, and public health impacts, among others, alongside ongoing resistance and protest. And, it's important to note, because we're going to come back to this in this presentation, is that these dynamics also intersect with and reflect this broader undermining of Indigenous sovereignty and community well-being. And so with all of this in mind, it's clear that mining raises a really wide range of ethical questions and challenges. And so again, so we're all on the same page, I just quickly want to review, what do I mean when I talk about ethics? In a broad sense, ethics refers to culturally understood and accepted moral principles that guide human behavior. And if you really want to simplify it, we're really just talking about, what constitutes right and wrong behavior. And so while I'll be discussing ethics in the context of mining and specifically this specific project, these lessons aren't limited just to that sphere and context. And so I hope everyone here will reflect on your own context and how and where ethics might apply, whether these resonate or there might be other ethics that I don't touch on here that might be significant in your work as well. So there's many different ways to understand ethics in this space. And before I dive into talking about the work, I want to highlight two broad ethical frameworks that emerged from the literature and early conversations with partners that kind of shape how we were thinking about ethics in the mining landscape. And those are Indigenous ethics of care and Western normative ethics. Of course, these are not the only ethical frames out there, but these were the most significant ones that came up for us in this work. And so recognizing that Indigenous ethics of care vary by nation and community, these frameworks do often share several common tenets, and those include things like relationality, reciprocity, and non-anthropocentrism, which really is just about decentering humans within this broader web of relations. And so from this ethical standpoint, humans are understood as one set of relatives among many, alongside plants, animals, mountains, rivers, and others, all of whom hold inherent value. These ethical approaches also emphasize responsibility to future generations in decision-making. And so as an example, looking specifically to my work context here on Anishinaabe-Aki, which includes what is now Michigan, some Anishinaabe teachings I have learned and continue to learn about through partners and through Anishinaabe scholars include ethical frameworks and relational frameworks like the 4 Rs, the 7 grandfathers, honorable harvest, and 7 generations. And of course, those are specific to the relationships and the place that I'm working in here. But kind of to turn more to that broad message, in the context of mining, an Indigenous ethic of care understands land and all beings as relatives. And that kind of framing shapes ethical obligations and responsibilities in this space. On the other hand, Western normative ethics are often described through three main frameworks, and they're big technical words. I'll explain what they mean. Those are consequentialism, deontology, and virtue ethics. And so in STEM fields, including those within the realm of mining, consequentialist and deontological approaches are the most commonly emphasized. And that just means that ethical thinking is often oriented around outcomes. That's that consequentialist ethic. And then rules, duties, and professional codes. And that's that deontological ethic. Virtue ethics are less commonly foregrounded in these kind of STEM contexts, but they're somewhat closer to care ethics in that they focus on this cultivation of ethical character and an embodiment of ethical values. And more broadly, Western ethical frameworks tend to be anthropocentric, meaning that they center human beings and human agency. And so within this framing, land is usually understood primarily as a resource rather than as a relative, and is evaluated in terms of its utility as an object for human benefit and extraction. So while it might seem that Indigenous ethics of care and Western normative ethics are completely incommensurable or at odds with one another, and if we're being honest, that was, my assumption going into this work, this research actually found some meaning areas of overlap and common ground between these frameworks. And while, of course, there are many areas of misalignment and tension and disagreement that still exist, considering both ethical frameworks and building from common ground can support more holistic ethical guidance, strengthen ethical practice in the mining space, and advance movement toward more just and sustainable futures. And so with all of that to kind of foreground what I'll be talking about, I'll dive into the work and some of our findings. So in addressing ethics in the mining sphere, we recognize the expertise of communities involved in and impacted by mining, and that this expertise should meaningfully guide research in this space. So as a result, we adopted a participatory approach to ensure that this work was responsive to community priorities and aimed to maximize community benefit. We started by identifying and reaching out to potential partners across tribal, regulatory, industry, nonprofit, and STEM contexts in the Great Lakes region. Some of these were mutual connections or existing relationships. Others were developed through cold emailing. And so we ultimately ended up working with 8 partners from tribal nations, mining companies, NGOs, and government agencies based in Michigan and Minnesota. Partners, as we kind of developed the work, participated in an open-ended survey and engaged in both small and full group discussions focused on both ethics in mining and on actually developing project ideas to address these ethical gaps that we see in the mining sphere. We held those small group meetings before the large group meetings, those full group meetings, to create space for more focused discussion, but also to build trust and create a space of comfort and conducive to participation before we brought everyone together from all of these different contexts. And through this process, partners collectively defined a project focused on developing holistic case-based ethics training for future mining professionals with a focus on earth scientists and engineers. So kind of one of the results of this work was that we also collaboratively developed a grant proposal, which was subsequently funded to support 3 years of actually developing this training collaboratively. And that was made possible by the National Science Foundation. So before discussing that training, I do want to share some of the themes that emerged from our surveys and group discussions. Interestingly, all partners, regardless of their context, identified ethical concerns and values spanning 4 broad areas, which you can see here. And those are environment, economy, social, and governance. And so what I've tried to show here and want to emphasize is that these considerations, these kind of ethical domains aren't siloed, but they're rather interrelated and overlapping. And so while specific priorities and concerns varied, among and even within partner groups, because these perspectives are not homogenous, these shared domains provided important ethical common ground for developing the curriculum. And kind of note is that this bears some resemblance to an existing investment framework that some of you all may be familiar with, and that is ESG, or Environment, Social, and Governance Investing. And we just thought that was kind of interesting that this mirrored that so well. And so in ESG, environment, social, governance, you might be wondering, where's the economic piece? It's missing. Well, actually in ESG, the economic piece is that investing component. And so economic considerations are often framed as kind of this separate and dominant factor influencing and influenced by these environmental, social, and governance pillars, rather than treated as a fully integrated, equally weighted domain. In contrast, what we're calling here, quote unquote, EESG, which we're treating as a set of related ethical domains rather than as an investing framework, brings economy in as this fourth equally positioned pillar intersecting with environment, social, and governance factors. And this allows for a more holistic and integrated view of ethics across these four interconnected domains. And so, while this shouldn't be conflated with ESG, it is notable that the main ethical themes we identified do align so closely with this existing framework. And I wanted to highlight it because it might be something that's relevant in your own working context. So if we return back to those broader guiding ethical frameworks that I shared earlier, Indigenous ethics of care and Western normative ethics, we actually did find areas of convergence in this work. And this doesn't mean that they're in or even near full agreement, but rather that they're not mutually exclusive and that they do share some meaningful common ground. Where they do diverge, those differences aren't really weaknesses. They're these actually really important spaces to engage as we work toward a more holistic understanding of ethics in mining. And so together, these frameworks can strengthen ethical reflection and practice in the sector by bringing a wider range of ethical considerations and perspectives into view. And this applies to any ethical frames in any context. And that's something I hope you'll take away, is that, we can learn by putting different ethical frameworks in conversation with one another. So you might be asking, and rightfully so, why common ground? Is it even possible? Is it worth it? What can it actually do? Does it overshadow these very real harms, legacies, and tensions we see in mining spaces? And those are all extremely valid questions, and they don't all have clear answers. What I will say is that in mining contexts, there's often a really strong focus on conflict and negative impacts like those we touched on earlier. And there's a good reason for that. It's really important that we are acknowledging these realities. These tensions, these harms, they are real and they shouldn't be minimized or overlooked. Going into this work, we kind of expected to see a lot of these patterns reflected in our conversations. And in a lot of ways we did, but alongside those tensions, we also found something that was kind of unexpected and also encouraging. And that's that there were these areas of meaningful overlap in how these different groups are thinking about mining. It's important to recognize that finding common ground isn't about being overly optimistic or ignoring real challenges. Instead, it's really a tool to offer a starting point or a place to begin more productive conversations and move toward better shared futures. And so getting to that point really depends on open-mindedness, which is that willing to recognize that our experiences and knowledge shape our perspectives, behaviors, and beliefs, and that others are coming from different places and have their own ways of understanding the world. And so that openness is what makes it possible to learn from one another and identify where common ground might exist. And these conversations, however, do also require a great deal of trust, and that does take time and care to build. So that's something to be mindful of as well. So from here, the question becomes not whether differences exist, because we all know that they do, but how can we collectively move forward in ways that are more ethically grounded? Also important to acknowledge is that these ethical considerations don't exist in a vacuum. They're shaped by broader histories and political and economic systems, including and especially colonial and capitalistic dynamics. And so this raises a really fundamental and good question, which is a single concrete ethical mining framework even possible within these systems? And I'll share my personal view, which is no, it's not. And I think attempting to develop a generalizable model of so-called ethical mining would actually risk reproducing many of the same harms we see in existing voluntary frameworks, which I'll talk about. At the same time, through this work, we also recognize that large-scale mining is happening, and it's likely to continue for some time to come. Our modern-day lifestyles are dependent on mining, and mining is so deeply embedded in the systems that shape our everyday lives. So within that reality, there are still meaningful steps that we can take to improve ethical practice within the sector. And so this context really helps explain why these conversations are so complex and why even partial common ground matters as a starting point for understanding and addressing gaps, tensions, and divergence, even where they can't necessarily be resolved. And so that's what we're trying to do through a more holistic ethics training, in our case, for engineering students. So turning now to that ethics training, we identified key gaps through conversations with partners in the mining literature and through an analysis of existing engineering ethics education resources. Many existing mining frameworks depend on compliance or voluntary reporting. The growth of these frameworks in recent decades reflects a growing awareness of ethical issues in the industry and the importance of attempting to address them. But while these approaches can support ethical expansion in these spaces, they often prioritize industry perspectives and don't fully address these kind of deeper environmental and social challenges that communities continue to face. They can be helpful tools, but they need to be used alongside deeper, more involved, genuine efforts. They can also oversimplify the mining landscape when they're not tailored to specific methods or materials, as they have different ethical considerations, and they frequently fail to reflect the diversity of communities and places impacted by mining. There's also a consistent lack of meaningful integration of community perspectives into mining practice. Several partners emphasized the importance of relational ethics grounded in place, empathy, reciprocity, care, and the inherent value of land and more than human beings, which are largely absent from the mining literature, engineering ethics education, and current mining practice. Many partners also highlighted responsibilities tied to Indigenous sovereignty and rights, consent, and particularly the free, prior, and informed consent of Indigenous peoples, environmental stewardship, cultural preservation, and responsibilities to future generations, which are similarly underrepresented, if they're represented at all, in these existing frameworks and resources. Looking at engineering ethics education specifically, we often see this focus on technical and professional responsibilities, drawing primarily on those consequentialist and deontological traditions. So these approaches, again, focused on evaluating outcomes, following professional codes, and fulfilling duties with competence and integrity are essential and important parts of ethical engineering practice. At the same time, partners emphasize that these frameworks alone don't capture the relational, place-based, or sovereignty-related dimensions of ethics that communities experience on the ground. And so relational and Indigenous ethical perspectives, which highlight these themes of reciprocity, of care, and responsibilities to human and more than human communities, remain largely absent from engineering ethics resources. And some partners even pointed to gaps in how these professional ethics translate into practice, especially in governance areas like trust building, planning, innovation, company culture, leadership, and management, among others. So in general, we're seeing this disconnect between current ethics education and on-the-ground practice. So overall, ethical training should be more holistic and developed with community voices so that it reflects on the ground realities and needs. And the goal of this work really is to help prepare more informed members of society and professionals who are better equipped to engage with complex ethical challenges. So this ethics training is really about, addressing those gaps, but also building on the common ground that we found. So it's being developed from areas of both convergence and tension, and it integrates concerns identified by communities on the front lines of mining so that this training is really more holistic than what's currently available, and it's responsive to real-world ethical challenges. It's aimed, like I mentioned, at future mining professionals, especially engineers, and it brings together multiple ethical perspectives. Alongside and woven within those EESG, environmental, economic, social governance related ethics, is this key focus on ethics of care and community, which are still largely missing from existing engineering ethics curricula. So the diagram you see here shows an overview of training objectives and was developed in alignment with Fink's taxonomy of significant learning. And that's an educational framework that's designed to support transformative long-term learning, as well as center care and human dimensions in the learning process, which, as we've discussed, was a gap our partners identified. Among some of the proposed learning objectives of this ethics training are, for example, that learners will be able to define and identify ethical considerations across economic, environmental, social, including cultural and spiritual, and governance domains in land-based extraction, explain the foundations of treaty rights, the principles of Indigenous sovereignty, and the rights of nature, integrate diverse ethical perspectives into engineering decision-making, consider how systems and worldviews shape ethical values, connect diverse knowledge systems to analyze mining challenges in a more holistic way, demonstrate empathy and engage effectively with perspectives and experiences different from their own, value ethical decision-making as central to engineering practice, demonstrate care about the impacts of engineering decisions on human and more than human beings and land, and reflect on how they learn to navigate ethical challenges in engineering and strengthen their ethical decision-making over time. However, as we were preparing to develop this training, many of our partners had to step away due to shifts in capacity and priorities under the current administration. And so this created a moment, or rather this is ongoing, this real discomfort for me because it disrupted the relationships and the reciprocity that community engaged work like this depends on. And so I struggled and, really, if I'm being honest, I still do with questions about, am I being extractive? And, have these concerns of whether we're doing justice to what our partners shared with us. And so it felt and often still feels really uncomfortable to move forward, let alone to feel confident that, we're doing this in a good way. And so rather than burying or trying to move past that discomfort, I've really tried to treat it as an important part of the ethical work itself by pausing for reflection, taking accountability, and really trying to be thoughtful about how to move forward. And I found there's a lot of parallels between the extractive nature of both mining and research. With mining, obviously, we're extracting geologic material, and in research, we've historically, and in some research still does, see this extraction of knowledge. And so there's actually, even though these things seem removed from each other, a lot of ethical overlap in how we think about these things. And for me, our partners share their expertise, stories, and experience with us. They took time with us. And that comes with ethical obligations and responsibilities tied to what's been shared. And it really led me to think about how the ethical commitments we're discussing in the mining space actually translate to the research process and how we uphold these commitments when the work is meaningfully disrupted, like it has been in this situation. Part of maintaining these commitments for me has been thinking about continuity. How are we keeping collaborators past and present informed and create opportunities for ongoing input while also thoughtfully expanding engagement. And so we still have resources to support community partners, which is part of a next step in broadening whose voices are shaping this work. And importantly, this kind of work doesn't always follow a clean path. And, in fact, community engaged work rarely does follow a clean path as capacity and priorities are constantly shifting. And so rather than seeing this as just a setback, we can take a minute and kind of reframe these moments as an opportunity to engage other communities now that we understand the landscape better. So for us, that includes communities close to home, right here at Michigan State, and creating space for students with lived experience and other expertise in these areas to be part of this research and get that experience. And so I encourage all of you to think about, how might these ideas translate into your own work and context? And at the core of this is this recognition that communities hold deep knowledge and expertise, and our responsibility is to approach that work with humility and to create conditions where communities can meaningfully lead the work. So we're not done there. We are still moving forward, and we're going to continue developing the ethics training in the form of case studies based on the stories and perspectives that have been shared with us. We aim to reflect those perspectives respectfully and respond to the needs and priorities that have been identified by our partners. And so as the curriculum evolves, we're going to prioritize keeping community partners informed and centered in the process while maintaining open invitations for re-engagement in whatever ways they choose or not. And so as we begin connecting with additional communities, we also recognize that there's going to be a range of responses. Not all communities will want to engage, and some communities realistically are going to feel frustrated that they weren't meaningfully engaged from the beginning. And that's part of community engaged work. It's something, I completely understand and respect, and we have to take accountability for and reflect on as we work to do better in this work moving forward. Following case review, pilot implementation of this curriculum at MSU, curriculum evaluation and revisions, and with partner consent, of course, we do plan to make these training materials open access and adaptable for different contexts to expand their reach and impact in land-based industries. And we're expecting that next summer at the earliest. So more broadly, I think of ethical commitments as guideposts. I think they can help keep the work grounded as it evolves. And these ethical commitments require us to remain accountable to the relationships and responsibilities that have shaped it, even in the face of disruption and change. So before we close, and recognizing that differences, discomfort, and structural tensions still do exist, I do want to highlight a few key takeaways and lessons that I hope you'll find useful and be able to carry into your own context, whether that's mining or otherwise. So one, even in contested spaces like mining, there's still value in identifying common ground if and where it exists as a starting point for ethical engagement. Second, open-mindedness and curiosity are important for understanding how experiences and worldviews shape the way we approach ethical dilemmas. Third, lived experience is a form of expertise. Communities should be empowered as decision makers and leaders, and of course with fair compensation for that expertise, in defining the problems they care about and shaping the solutions to address them. And finally, expanding and rethinking ethics in this space depends on building reciprocal, respectful relationships and fulfilling long-term responsibilities. Ethical commitments can serve as guideposts as we navigate complexity, disagreement, and disruption. Of course, I hope there's many other things you're able to take with you, but these are some key takeaways that I wanted to highlight and I thought might be transferable across contexts. So before I close, I want to acknowledge the support that made this work possible. First, acknowledging the National Science Foundation for 2 grants that funded this work, and also just noting our opinions, findings, and conclusions and recommendations are those of our team and don't necessarily reflect the views of the National Science Foundation. And I would especially like to thank our project partners in the Great Lakes region, who took the time to meet with us. We, fully acknowledge and understand that our partners live the realities of this work, and we truly would not be able to develop this project or even have defined this project without their full participation, involvement, and expertise. And it truly is an honor to collaborate, learn, and co-create with them. And we appreciate their support, past, present, and future. So that is all I have for now. Thank you again for being here. And thank you to the Stewardship Network for having me and opening the space to discuss these important issues. And with that, I'm hoping for some good questions, and I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you so much, Sophie. Really appreciate it. There was a lot of great information, a lot of great things to think about. So a reminder to everybody that's in the audience, please do share your questions in the Q&A function via Zoom. We will get to as many of those as possible. And then you can use the chat function in Zoom just to share comments or resources that might be relevant to the conversation. But again, please do share your questions via Q&A. So I had a question, and I'm sorry if I missed this part, but I'm curious about specifically what types of partners you were working with on this project. Like, I assume you were trying to get a good collection of different, representation from different folks, like within the industry and like other types of folks. So could you dig a little bit more into who you were engaging with as partners in the project?
Absolutely. So actually in the beginning, we reached out to over 50 folks from all of these different contexts. A lot of those were cold emails. Several we just didn't hear back from. There were a lot more that were really interested in the work, that saw the value in it, but just didn't have the capacity or legally were not allowed to participate. And so we ended up working with kind of 8 core partners, and they brought in folks from their spaces as well along the way. But those partners came from tribal nations, NGOs, government agencies, and mining companies, specifically in Michigan and Minnesota. We did reach out to potential partners in other states, but those are the spaces that the folks we worked with were coming from.
Thank you for that. And one quick follow-up to that. In terms of the mining companies, I'm really curious about what your value proposition was to them and how you participated in like a reciprocal way. And maybe I'm making assumptions here, but we're thinking about things that may or may not restrict the way that these mining companies do their work, if these ethics are implemented. So I'm just curious about how those conversations went and what was it that made them excited or willing to participate in the project.
I mean, can completely read between the lines here. I get exactly what you're saying. It's, these are assumptions and worries and concerns I had going into it. I'm not going to dismiss the reality that there are ulterior motives within the broader mining landscape. The way we approached this work is really from a place of trusting what our partners are sharing with us and creating that space for open sharing. We are very fortunate to work with a mining company who has been really engaging in this kind of work in recent years and, thinking about how do we improve relationships with communities and coming to a space where that's valued. Of course, we can't separate mining from broader systems and, the profit motive. But, in the conversations that we did have, our mining partner was very open, very transparent, very receptive to what we were talking about. Of course, there were critiques from other partners in the space, and we really were able to just have an open dialogue. And, these mining companies, they see ethical gaps too. And, the value for them is they want professionals to come into their companies and know how to do these things. And a lot of the focus was on governance, thinking of relationships in terms of like stakeholder engagement or rights holder engagement. But, that's a step. And that's where those kind of overlaps come into play. Like, where's the common ground? Where's the shared value? And it does exist. It might look different. Not every mining company is going to share these values, be as cooperative, engage in this space like our partners did. But But I think just really emphasizing those relationships was where we found that space to engage together and have that kind of common ground across these environmental, economic, social governance concerns.
Yeah, thank you for that. So now digging into a couple questions that folks have submitted, we had a few that were asking, could you be more specific about you had the Venn diagram and then you had the overlap, and they're curious about what actually existed within that overlap in terms of what you were seeing, in terms of those kind of different ethical frameworks and how the different partners were valuing things within the system.
Absolutely. So I showed the Venn diagram and then like the four interrelated spheres. And so I think a starting point is to, discuss the relationship between those. So the overarching kind of ethical frameworks or ways of viewing the world that we were engaging with were, those Western ethics and indigenous ethics of care. Within those ethical systems, there are ethical concerns in both about the environment, about society, about governance, about economy. And so those are more kind of applied ethics, and that's where we found some of that common ground. It might look differently, like there were those bullet points next to each of the environmental, economic, social governance factors. And those kind of highlight some maybe like specific ways of thinking about those things, and they vary by those broad ethical frameworks. And again, I'm not trying to paint a picture that there's so much overlap, there's so much convergence, but there is a little bit. And it's going to look differently based on who you're engaging with. Again, these perspectives are not homogenous. I've specifically been working with Anishinaabe nations communities, but what those indigenous ethics of care look like are going to vary based on who you're working with. And same with those Western normative ethics, how they're applied and thought about vary by context. And so, it's not a concrete or maybe the clearest answer you want to hear, but that's really the importance of doing this in a relational way, is that you find that overlap regardless of what ethical frameworks you're working with by having those conversations and seeing, there are all these differences, but where are those points of connection where they come together?
Mhm. Yeah, thank you for that. Another kind of group of questions that we have is about the proposed implementation for this type of work. And so part of that is where are you seeing an appetite for this, either in folks that determine the curriculum or in folks that might be impacted by this type of learning and ethics being implemented into the curriculum. So curious about how that's looking, or if you're at that phase yet, or how that's all coming together.
Yeah, definitely. This is actually something we talked extensively about with our partners, like who needs to see this? Where are we implementing it? Our partners, they want to see this not just at universities, but in government agency trainings, in like mining company trainings, in nonprofit contexts. There's all of these spaces where it can be implemented. We're starting at MSU, piloting that curriculum in an engineering course. We'll then take that, evaluate it, make revisions in conversation with community partners. And once we feel like it's at a good point and it's, responsive to community needs, to student needs, and fill those gaps, we do plan to make it open access and have adaptable versions of it. And so the way we're building these cases is we're going to have these super extensive, massive cases with all of the information you could ever want to kind of work through a case. And then we'll have a smaller version and then an even smaller version. And so our hope is that different contexts will be able to adapt these cases for, their own needs. And with that, it's also important to acknowledge that this kind of work, land-based work, is very place-based. And so the cases we're developing are coming out of specific conversations and relationships that we have and topics that we discussed that have immediate relevance to Anishinaabe Yaqui, to Michigan. Those things are going to vary based on where you're at, what your context is. And so we hope there's those foundational principles in there that can then, be used and kind of changed and modified based on what's needed. But I really recommend, this is a starting point if you are interested in engaging with these, but using it as just that, a starting point. Really think about and reflect on what are the ethical needs in your spaces as well.
Great, thank you. So yeah, just digging through some of these other questions. One is, sorry if I missed this, but were there specific past, present, or future mining projects that prompted this work? And are there, I think we already talked about a little bit of the specific implementations that you see people planning to take. But yeah, is there any background on what kind of prompted this work in the first place?
Yeah, there wasn't a specific mining project. I think we can all agree that, what we hear and see about mining in the media is largely negative. We see a lot of, you know, environmental harm, social harm, protests, like a lot of really harmful things that are rooted and grounded in these kind of violent histories and systems. And for me, this started in undergrad. It's actually more of a personal journey, I guess. I started pursuing archaeology, and then I took a class that touched on these issues. And I was like, wow, like what a different and interesting and timely intersection of geology and anthropology. And so I took a hard pivot in my graduate studies and met with who's now my advisor, had a conversation like, I want to do something about these issues. And she was kind of like, I've been waiting for a student to approach me and say those exact words. Let's get a grant and do it. And so that's how it started. It wasn't necessarily a specific mining operation for me, but rather these broader patterns that we see in the mining industry and how I, with my background in geology and anthropology, and as someone with access to resources, can do what I can to address these issues, even if it's, a drop in the ocean. It's something, and maybe will inspire greater change in other spaces too.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Then to end it on I might consider this a bit of a spicy one, but I'm just curious in general, your feelings on this, because I'm hearing some folks in the Q&A expressing some skepticism about how willing or enthusiastic certain folks would be to integrate this type of thinking into their work. And thinking about the difference between voluntary implementation and a program that, helps to promote that versus are there any kinds of regulatory, aspects to this where you could say, no, actually, you have to go through this framework to some degree and prove how you did it. So I'm just curious about that because, some folks are expressing some skepticism about certain mining company, being willing, and even thinking about how folks on the ground, if this process is used and the mine still goes through that they did not want to go through, that can also be a challenging feeling for them too, right? So I guess just digging into a little bit of that gray area about how folks will react to the implementation of this, and also how voluntary versus kind of required you might see it be happening.
Yeah, I mean, this highlights the messiness of this space. And I was totally expecting questions like this, like a lot of questions like this, because, of course, I bring my personal views to this space and, hold a degree of skepticism as well. And these are things that our partners absolutely were talking about, like issues of greenwashing and ulterior motives and profit motive and resistance to engage and how genuine are these efforts. Like these are all things that came up and we talked about. And I don't have a great answer. Like the reality is that not all mining companies are there. A lot of them are not there. And so, in these conversations with partners, I think they really highlighted the importance of, again, those relationships. And it can be, some partners, communities, mining companies, they're not there, and it can be hard to engage or initiate engagement. And again, like you mentioned, regulation, that's such a big piece of this, is there really is a lack of rigorous regulation in this space. And so it can't just be the voluntary frameworks, the training, the community-based efforts. Our partners all describe that, we need to see these things translate into regulation. There needs to be actual accountability mechanisms to enforce these things. And that's what's lacking in these voluntary frameworks. And so my area of specialty is not policy, it's not regulation. I'm kind of doing what I can in the education space, which is, my kind of area of expertise. But we absolutely acknowledge the importance of regulation and, are doing what we can on our side to start inserting some of those values to train professionals who are more open to these kinds of things. And, it's long-term thinking, hopefully integrate these ethics and these ways of thinking into their practice and value communities as decision makers, as leaders, not just human, but more than human as well, and how they approach these kinds of practices.
Yeah, yeah. No, and I think that's really important because again, you have to start somewhere, and I think starting in an education focus, you're thinking about what are the future leaders in these spaces and who are they going to be and how are they going to be thinking about these issues. And so I think that will help change the socio-political landscape that we find ourselves in that may end up being more, agreeable to certain ththings like that, or more enthusiastic even about voluntary initiatives. But oh my goodness, and we could go on forever, as I'm sure you can tell. We just we dug into a really complicated one at the very end, so forgive me. But I know that you shared your contact info in the slide, and if you want to share that again, you can feel free, or we can make sure to get that out to folks. But actually, yeah, and if you want to share it in the chat, maybe Sophie. But I just want to get into the very end of our presentation, the outro from the Stewardship Network. So allow me to go ahead and share my screen there. Forgive me. They are tricking me with where this is. There we are. Hopefully you are seeing my screen now. So we encourage all of you to become a regular and register for upcoming episodes of interest. These webcasts happen on the second Wednesday of the month in the Eastern Time Zone's noon hour. And we'll send you a reminder in the morning of the webcast anytime you sign up. So visit stewardshipnetwork.org/webcast to learn more about upcoming webcasts and also to see some of our archives. So coming up in July next month, we have Rain Gardens, the Tricky, the Watery, and the Inspiring with Susan Bryan, Washtenaw County Water Resources Commissioner's Office. Next, in August, we have Stewardship Starts with Community, Insights from Parks, Policy, and Nonprofits. That's with Rebecca Stanfield McCown, who is with YMCA Alliance of Northern New England, formerly the National Park Service's Stewardship Institute. And in September of 2026, we have Freshwater Mussel Monitoring and Relocation ahead of the Peninsular Dam Removal with Paul Steen with the Huron River Watershed Council. That is one near and dear to our hearts here at the Stewardship Network in our local office and geography, so we're looking forward to that one. And finally, please do submit to the Spring Challenge. Reminder that the deadline is June 30th, and that any of your great stewardship work that you have completed from April 8th through June 30th it qualifies for the challenge. And let's do more together. So visit stewardshipnetwork.org/spring, and we really appreciate you taking the time to do that. With that, have a wonderful rest of the day and a wonderful rest of the week, and we hope to see you again soon. Take care.